Poland is leaving the Istanbul Convention, or is at least planning to do so, and I'm reading the treaty. As you know, I've already read the preamble and the first 5 chapters, and I'm going to read the 6th chapter today. But because that one is so dull, I have decided to focus a bit this episode on the body that has created it, the Council of Europe. And this is in part necessary because not only people outside of Europe, like in North America, have a hard time to kind of teleport the different councils and organizations that exist, the supranational entities, and this is particularly bad in Europe. There is a wonderful diagram on the Wikipedia page that shows a number of supranational organizations, and you see the Council of Europe, the Schengen area, the Visegrad Group, the Nordic Council, the European Union, the Eurozone, the EU Customs Union, and so forth. And most people really have a hard time to understand what is what. To add more to the confusion, the European Union has signed this treaty as well, so they are not the Council of Europe that has created the treaty, but they have signed it, and so we can expect it to be somehow ratified, or that they try to bully the member states into ratification. According to Wikipedia and also the self-description of the Council itself is only a human rights organization. It has no binding powers. I just read the first sentence on Wikipedia. The Council of Europe is an international organization whose stated aim is to uphold human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in Europe. But the confusion is, of course, of historical nature, because originally, that's the history given by Wikipedia, and I think that's quite accurate. Originally, the floated idea was very unspecific. So under the section history, Wikipedia writes, in a speech in 1929, French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand floated the idea of an organization which would gather European nations together in a federal union to resolve common problems. But it was Britain's wartime leader Winston Churchill who first publicly suggested the creation of a Council of Europe in a BBC radio broadcast on the 21st of March 1943, while the Second World War was still raging. In his own words, he tried to peer through the mists of the future to the end of the war, once victory had been achieved, and think about how to rebuild and maintain peace on a shattered continent. So the original idea of the Council of Europe is supposed to be the same as the original idea of the European Union. The latter one is closer to that actual federal nation that Europe has become than the Council of Europe. As I said, the European Union is one of the signatories of the Istanbul Convention. It does so because it is basically a state-like entity, and it is explained in the Wikipedia section, aims and achievements of the Council of Europe entry of Wikipedia, that the European Union is this body that basically takes the sovereignty, the national sovereignty from the people, and puts it on a supranational level, quote unquote, because we all know they're supranational, multilateral, blah blah blah, just means that they put the government organizations on a level where it's unassailable to your voter. So it says here, whereas the member states of the European Union transfer part of their national legislative and executive powers to the European Commission, and the European Parliament, Council of Europe member states maintain their sovereignty, but commit themselves through conventions and treaties, in brackets international law, and cooperate on the basis of common values and common political decisions. So the Council of Europe is supposedly just some treaties that are more or less binding, or that they all agree to uphold, but it's not a national body. This is only partially true because the Council of Europe entertains a court of its own, the Court of Human Rights, and this one is supposed to judge among the member states and dole out verdicts against those who have mistreated their own population. Those those states then are free to accept this verdict and become better in future. And this is only the most famous body. There is a long list of institutions on Wikipedia, which I can barely read out to you for the sake of time, but there's a Secretary General the media doesn't ever talk about. I don't know if he is even important. Does he have a job? Is the sinecure office? God knows what. Then there's a committee of ministers. Also, their meetings never get the headlines, whatever they are doing. I'm not quite sure. Then there is a parliamentary assembly, also just gathering some people from diverse parliaments. Then there's the Congress of the Council of Europe, which is about local and regional authorities. The Commissioner for Human Rights, which is a sinecure office, of course. The Conference of INGOs, so that's something about NGOs. And I think this is the most troublesome part about European politics, that we fail to guard the limits of government, and we have this mesh of NGOs and government bodies, and nobody can tell who is who. People who are not accountable get into semi-official positions. There's a joint council on youth of the Council of Europe. Another worrisome aspect of European politics is that we have ministries and stuff particularly addressing the youth, which is, I believe, very Maoist. It has this cultural revolutionary flair. The education is somehow the responsibility of the government. Not to my taste. And then there is information offices and a number of semi body construct like things, advisory boards, a development bank. That's basically like a subsidy office. You know, the thing that really troubles me is that as a European, you barely know any of these bodies. And also, you know, the diagram that I showed you at the beginning, your average citizen does not know the organs with which he supposedly gives himself the laws and the rules. And before I continue about the difficulties of international law and the trouble of this cooperation, multilateralism, and so forth, I run you through that boring chapter. Chapter 6, Investigation, Prosecution, Procedural Law, and Protective Measures. Article 49 is again these general obligations that are very vague, so we'll skip that. Article 50, Immediate Response, Prevention, and Protection. Number 1, parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that the responsible law enforcement agencies respond to a form of violence. This time the police will come. Number 2, parties shall take the necessary legislation or other measures to ensure that the responsible law enforcement agencies engage promptly. So this time, the policeman will come fast. Article 51, Risk Assessment and Risk Management. Parties shall take the necessary legislative and other measures to ensure that an assessment of the lethality risk, the seriousness of the situation, and the risk of repeated violence is carried out by all relevant authorities in order to manage the risk and, if necessary, to provide coordinated safety and support. So now you build a police station. Number 2, parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that the assessment referred to in paragraph 1 duly takes into account at all stages of the investigation and application of protective measures the fact that perpetrators of acts of violence covered by the scope of this convention possess or have access to firearms. Article 52, Emergency Barring Orders. Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that the competent authorities are granted the power to order, in situations of imminent danger, a perpetrator of domestic violence to vacate the residence of the victim or person at risk for a sufficient period of time, and to prohibit the perpetrator from entering the residence of or contacting the victim or person at risk. Measures taken pursuant to this article shall give priority to the safety of victims or persons at risk. That also is already law. Article 53, Restraining and Protection Orders. I don't want to pretend that I can tell the difference between the previous article after reading it. I have no idea. The next one is Article 54, investigations and evidence, and it says parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that in any civil or criminal proceedings, evidence relating to the sexual history and conduct of the victim shall be permitted only when it is relevant and necessary. You know what? I don't even know what legislation does have what protections in place and so forth. But these things are all one-offs, aren't they? Or at least most of these things. I always say, this has been established, just call the police and stuff. But even just imagine you had no police stations whatsoever and there's absolutely no courtroom, and you have to establish these things, right? Wouldn't it be enough for the country to establish that once after you have worked down all these items they have? Why do you stay in the convention? Article 55, ex parte and ex officio proceedings. Number 1, parties shall ensure that investigations into a prosecution of offences established in accordance with Articles 35, 36, and so forth of this convention shall not be wholly dependent upon a report or complaint filed by a victim if the offence was committed in whole or in part on its territory, and that the proceedings may continue even if the victim withdraws her or his statement or complaint. So this is the case where we disagree. So let's just resume what I have said about the previous articles. You either have something is already established, or it's a one-time change, or you disagree. And when you disagree, you don't wish a backdoor deal like this one to legislate your parliaments. You actually want, as a voter, to have a say, and it should be a general debate whether or not something should be investigated after all parties say, let's get the authorities out of our business, right? Number 2, parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure, in accordance with conditions provided for by the internal law, the possibility for governmental and non-governmental organizations and domestic violence counselors to assist and or support victims at their request during investigations and judicial proceedings concerning the offences established in accordance with this convention. I don't know why they think women who have suffered whatever violence, that they are detached from any, counselors and any organizations. They still have a phone, they still can meet anybody, they are not under prosecution, they have full access to everything anyway. So what do they desire to establish? And we are back to what I see as the 3 pillars that run through everything now, which is they either want something that is already done or is a one-off, or number 2, they want something that the population does not like, and they try to order it top-down instead of respecting the democratic process. And number 3 is that they usually try to grab funds and weave in the NGOs into the government proceedings. And here you have again this case where they talk about giving special access to NGOs and so forth. So what they want is that a professional that's actually concerned with a complaint of a woman to call an NGO left-wing group to get involved. Article 56, measures of protection, as well as legal aid and statute of limitation. This is the kind of stuff that you would expect to be in place anyway. So a lot of it is unnecessary, but you also have to imagine that you don't actually want too many international agreements that actually add new rules, because they are talking about an organization and a procedure that actually comes with implementing new rules. And what problem I face when I listen to these people that want always more international cooperation, always more regulation, always more prohibitions, rules, and so forth, to be fixed on an international level, on a supranational level. The same people will always tell you that they don't want any military intervention, and also no other sanctions like economic sanctions, because that would hit the poor, of course. Yeah. So what do you expect if you create ever more international rules? You need something to enforce the rules. And there is a contradiction that many people don't come to terms with. Either you have as few international laws as possible and get those enforced with sanctions and with military action, or you have a proliferation of laws and rules, and then it's to the strongest man in the room to enforce a selection of rules on his own whims. Then basically you don't have any rules. So you have to kind of make a decision. There is, of course, a place for international cooperation, and we all should support that. Military cooperation, economic cooperation, also sometimes the law enforcement needs cooperation. You need to extradite criminals to places where they come from and so forth. There are places where international cooperation makes sense, but you have a lot of advocates that just pretend that everything that's done on international level is cuddly sweet and so forth. The last point I want to make is whenever you see some sleaze, you should hear the alarm. You just saw how Ellen DeGeneres was busted. If you paid attention, if you did so before, there was a lot of gossip going on for many years that she is a very, very different person behind the doors than when the camera is rolling. Everybody knew, and now she is busted for mistreating her own employees. That's the kind of person you always find in public life, particularly those that are politically active. And on the supranational level, you have a lot of people that constantly lecture us on how cuddly nice solidarity, multilateral peacekeeping, and so forth, everything is they do. And that should raise the alarm in itself. Thank you for listening, and I see you soon. Bye.